In fact, there are only two fears that we are all born with. Every other fear, apart from those two, develop in us after birth. When I heard that, my mind reeled, trying to work out what were the only two fears I and everyone else was born with. Was it a fear of death? A fear of not having enough food? A fear of being dropped? I'm guessing your mind is reeling too right now. So what do you think? What are the only two fears we are born with and that we all have at birth? On Stories of Self, we go on journeys into the lives of ourselves and others. We see how stories connect, how they diverge, and how we can create our worlds and solve our problems. This is the real-life remix of storytelling, which is so often stranger than fiction. So come and sit around the fire, chill by the ocean, or get a coffee with me, as I delve into the stories of self that make, break, and remake us. Some stories are dramatic, some are serene, some will magically mirror you, and some will be delightfully different. I'm your host, Katie Reeve Arnold, and this is Stories of Self. Recently, we've chatted about cultivating connections. But are we all looking for the same kind of connections? Not exactly. So that's what makes it so difficult to connect sometimes. Not only are we each bringing something a bit different to the world, ourselves, but we are also all looking for something a bit different in each other. And actually, both who we are being and what we are looking for changes through life. So we might mean it when we say, "Till death us do part." But then we can find that because we all change constantly, one or both of us can change in ways that no longer matches well with what we had wanted at the start and no longer matches well with our partner. This is a weird and wild, nostalgic and bittersweet journey at best. But at worst, it can be downright confusing, depressing, and painful. We are all born with certain needs, and these are actually pretty basic, and we share them all. They are more biological than linked to the person we are and will in the end become. We need air, shelter, water, food, light, sleep, and connection of some kind. If you remove any of those, then we will be severely stifled in our growth, or indeed, we won't survive at all. So we commence on our quest to secure these things in our life. And really that quest continues throughout life. These are our basic survival needs. But as we grow, we can potentially start to move away from them. Or not. The choice is ours. But we tend to develop fears and attachments around these core needs early in life. Before we are even aware that we are doing it, we are actually taking what is around us and our experiences and creating a baseline in relation to these things. And if that baseline has any restrictions or introduces any issues with these factors, then we will develop some kind of fear around it. And it is this fear that leads us to become attached to a certain way of being, that which we felt safer in, and to resist another way of being, that which we felt unsafe in. It might sound odd, but we are actually not born with a fear of not getting what we need in relation to air, shelter, food, water, light, sleep, and connection. Yes, we do cry out for them, but it's not yet in any fear that they won't come. Rather, we are just using our restricted communication tools. Imagine what it would be like to have no fears, no phobias, no concerns at all in relation to these things. This is very difficult for many people to imagine, me included. Because our fears in relation to these core factors developed so young, and our coping mechanisms in relation to them were formed immediately and honed only by the fact of whether they worked or not. Last week we heard Suzanne talk about pain and relate a concept where when a child is in pain, they will often get something they desire, either connection with someone else or a treat. So this has the potential to condition us, that pain leads to the support we desire, and so create a framework where being in pain could be neuropathically connected to getting something we need. As wild as it sounds, this feedback loop can start behavioral and physiological adaptations that serve us in one very basic way, while absolutely not being the best thing or the thing we want in another way. Isn't that wild? It almost sounds impossible until we recognize that this is essentially a within individual version of what we large-scale notice in evolution. That adaptation which is pertinent to success is selected for and so more likely to be repeated in the next generation. And that which works for us to get what we need is then repeated over and over, whether it is the best thing for us and our quality of life or not. Now, I said though that without fear of these needs, air, shelter, food, water, light, sleep, and connection, being introduced to us sometime after birth, then we don't naturally have them. Wow. Immediately we can see how reality for someone who has had a lot of fear developed around having enough air, shelter, food, water, light, sleep, and connection would be very, very different. And it would be a very different reality they would inhabit than the one experienced by somebody who had never developed any fears around having air, shelter, food, water, light, sleep, and connection. In this way, we can understand and accept the truth that, although we all exist in the same world and reality day to day, in actual fact, we do not. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that the realities that we are experiencing can actually be very different to each other, even if we only take one factor into account, the capacity to access basic needs, and so never develop fears in relation to these. We can imagine how hugely complicated then it can get when we add in many, 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 many other factors. And this is the point. We are all different. Not only are we born different, but we are exposed to, encounter or experience different realities from the moment we are born. In fact, there are only two fears that we are all born with. Every other fear, apart from those two, develop in us after birth. When I heard that, my mind reeled, trying to work out what were the only two fears I and everyone else was born with. Was it a fear of death? A fear of not having enough food? A fear of being dropped? I'm guessing your mind is reeling too right now. So what do you think? What are the only two fears we are born with and that we all have at birth? Well, I nearly got there with thinking about a fear of being dropped, because actually the fear of falling is one we are born with, which makes sense. It permeates our dreams and can be enough to wake us from our sleep. It is definitely deep-rooted. The second fear we are all born with is the fear of loud noises. This also makes sense. Babies can react to sound before birth when they are still in the womb. Okay, so fear of falling and loud noises. But if these are the only two fears we are born with, and we are all born with them, then all our other fears develop afterwards. Everything else I am afraid of phobic of, or just plain avoid so much that I've potentially forgotten exactly why I do, all these fears or aversions developed in me since birth for one reason or another. Meaning, firstly, that I have developed an inner narrative, whether it is or remains true or false. I have developed an inner narrative around them all. And secondly, that these narratives or stories are specifically mine, born of my experiences. So everyone else has different narratives to me. And whether my narrative is slightly different to someone else's or very different, slightly similar or very similar, the point is that across all the millions of narratives that I've developed, there will be variability from every other person alive, or indeed, every other person who has ever lived and will ever live. We are all different, and that is the point. We are unique and complex, and that is the point. It is not the point for us to agree with anyone else on everything else, because we simply don't come from or live in the exact same reality as anyone else. You might be thinking, wait, but don't we share reality? Don't we live in it together? Well, yes and no. We share a connected world. Yes, but no. Our experience of it, and therefore our perspective in it, is not the same as anyone else's. The difference is like the difference in how we experienced the full moon a few days ago. Did you enjoy the full moon a few days ago? I did. So in one way, we all had the same full moon. We share it. But in another way, we all experienced it differently. How did you spend the recent full moon? I spent it flying on a moto taxi through a forest full of sleeping monkeys after an open mic night with amazing musicians. I spent it at a water temple and zipping through the crowded streets to dance bachata and salsa in the post-rainstorm open air of a light-scattered vine-covered courtyard with a live Latin band under the moon, feeling completely free. We share reality, yes, but we all experience it differently. Even the people who shared those exact events with me had variability in the way they experienced them. So what is all this about? Why do we need to think actively about the fact that we are all coming from and living in and moving towards different realities? Well, it helps. It really, really, really helps in several really important ways. It helps us to have compassion and understanding for ourselves. We are not experiencing the same as anyone else and haven't in the past. So we can reflect and learn to embrace our own path instead of trying to push ourselves into cookie-cutter forms. It helps us to have compassion for others and to understand that they are not from, in, or going to the exact same reality as the one we are. And we can let them be different because they are, and that is okay. It helps us to let go of the narrative or story that we tell ourselves about what others do, based usually on our own acquired, deep-rooted fears and patterning. And to simply let others' actions be their actions and part of their story. It can help us to let go of the narrative or story we tell ourselves about ourselves. Again, usually based on our own deep-rooted fears and patterning. Maybe things that we have never noticed or thought about before. But we can bring that to light, not to perseverate on it, but to be able to notice and recognize any links that things have with today. And it can help us to notice where other options are available to us now. And in that, we can create opportunity to make different choices, not to act on a repetition of past patterns anymore. It can help us to notice other people in our lives and consider whether their behavior is repetitive and may be driven by past patterns. If it is, then we can't change them. This is key. Each person only has the capacity to truly change themselves. We have full control over ourselves in the ways we respond. We have no control over others. Recognizing and giving grace for our different realities helps us not to make assumptions. I don't know if you've ever heard that little phrase based on how it's spelt, that to assume makes an ass of you and me. ASSUME. It's a good one to remember though, because assuming does not help us at all. It helps us not to take things personally as well, because we each have our own reality going on, and other people's reality is usually about them, not me. It helps us not to have expectations and not to make comparisons, because those are the thief of joy. And it helps us not to judge. We let a situation be and make our own choices based on what it is being, without giving power away to the situation or other person maybe within it to need to change to suit us. Essentially, it helps us to take ownership of what is our own choice and release any hold over what is not. Because we can't control others, nor should we. Do you want to be controlled by someone else? I don't. And if I did, then that would speak towards a giving up on myself, which leads to even bigger or deeper problems because it creates a life not truly lived. But that's another story of self for another time. So what we actually need to look towards is not agreement. This is one of the ways in which our world is going wrong and falling into polarities and conflict. But instead of looking towards agreement, we can look towards understanding. Not all being the same, but peaceably tolerating our differences. And in that, with compassion, we can start to see that we are better for our differences, not worse. We are all telling our stories, and we are all telling ourselves stories about it all. Are you brave enough to walk with me into hearing, considering, and understanding the stories we tell? Join me next time, where we'll be considering more stories and illusions and stepping into creating the freedom we desire. Every moment, we are who we are choosing to be. You choose. Choose you, because your story matters.